Under center versus pistol, why it does and does not matter, but also how it could be the key to unlocking Michael Penix's next level as a passer.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back to another episode of Locked On Falcons. I'm your humble host, Aaron Freeman, aka Sirius Black. And on today's daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, we are continuing the Falcons filling out their 53-man roster by adding quarterback Trevor Simeon and running back Brian Robinson and what they bring to the table. We'll be discussing how under center offense isn't a magic fix for the Falcons' issues, but what we're hoping to see from Michael Penix in two key areas that why this offense could improve by going more under center with him. And we'll start today's episode talking about why under center offense seemingly matters and why this became such a huge issue for the Falcons as well as the rest of the NFL in 2025. And so when we're talking about under center and talking about quarterback alignment, distinguishing between under center, pistol, and shotgun offense, one of the I believe false narratives that came out of last year in regards to the Falcons was, their usage of under center versus pistol and shotgun was about how predictable their offense was, particularly early in the season. Now, we went on the podcast during the bye week back in September and kind of debunked this, but I'll reiterate the sort of broad points I made back then, again on today's episode, that essentially in the NFL, down in distance dictate whether or not a team is running or passing the football, right? The only real situations in the NFL where you have a neutral run or pass situation is 1st and 10 and 2nd and medium being 2nd and 4, 5, or 6, right? That really it's about that's dictating whether you're running the football. And alignment is really about enhancing your ability to run or pass the football, right? That under center offense as well as pistol is primarily a run first offense because it's easier and more effective to run from under center or pistol, right? NFL teams run roughly about 70% of the time in both formations. And then shotgun is primarily a passing situation, and NFL teams throw the ball roughly 75% of the time because it's easier to throw the ball out of shotgun because the quarterback has better vision, for the field. And under center and pistol work because the running back has better angles when it comes to hitting the hole when it comes to the run game. Now, when it comes to throwing the football, shotgun is best for pass, followed by pistol, followed by under center, right? When we're talking about pure drop back passing. However, that switches when play action passing is involved, where the reverse is true, right? The better it is when it comes to selling your run, play action is more effective. So under center is the best when it comes to play action, followed by pistol, then by shotgun. And that's really where under center offense matters, right? That it's really about selling your play action passing, right? Because it's not necessarily because, the defense is keying on the run more likely because it's more likely to be a run because it's under center, which is part of it. But it's mostly because the quarterback turns his back to the defense. And so therefore he can sell the run fake harder. And that gets the linebackers to bite harder, which creates a bigger void in the middle of the field that can now be exploited by the quarterback when he gets his head back around and attacks the middle. And that gets us to what we want to break down next on the show. And again, for the audio listeners, this is a great opportunity to go to YouTube. I have a graph that shows, charting EPA, expected points added per play in play action, going all the way back to 2019. And in this chart, you can see under center, under blue, pistol in red, and shotgun in yellow. And we go back to 2019 because that was the first year that Zach Robinson became an assistant coach in the NFL. That's also the first full season that Kevin Stefanski was calling plays in the NFL. So this indicates sort of the body of work for the most recent Falcons offensive coordinator, as well as, the current Falcons offensive coordinator, although technically Tommy Rees is that guy, but we will leave that aside. So from 2019 to 2023, the 5 years prior to Zach Robinson's arrival in Atlanta, pistol actually outperformed under center in terms of average play action EPA per play in 4 out of those 5 years, right? However, in 2024, pistol's effectiveness basically bottomed out. And that was also the only year in this sample, or the first year in this sample, where pistol actually was less effective in terms of play action than shotgun is, which is generally the least effective way to design play action passes, right? Now, it did rebound a little bit in 2025, but the last 2 years in particular, there has been a massive gap between how effective under center has been versus how pistol has been when it comes to play action. And now, part of this data is due to a sample size issue, right? We have a lot more under center and shotgun plays than we have pistol plays over this 7-year sample, about 9 times as many under center plays as pistol plays, 6 times as many shotgun plays as pistol plays. And that's why I think these numbers, when you look at this graph, and you look at the blue and you look at the yellow that represent under center and shotgun respectively, it's a lot more consistent year to year. It's a lot more stable because you have a lot, thousands of plays that we're talking about as opposed to a few hundred plays over the course of the last 7 years. And so pistol seems to be a lot more volatile on this graph because you're not dealing with as big a sample size. So that is part of why you see these differences. And why you can't necessarily say, oh, yes, pistol is automatically better than under center. But it is worth noting that if you're Zach Robinson and you're arriving in Atlanta in 2024 and arriving on a team that already runs a ton of pistol, again, which is one of my main beefs with this whole under center versus pistol discourse when it comes to the Falcons, is that a lot of people focus so much on 2025, forgetting the fact that in 22 and 23 and then in 2024, that the Falcons were also a heavy pistol team, and yet almost nobody complained about it back then because they understood that the issues with the offense had little to do with quarterback alignment and had more to do with the quarterback and the offensive line and the weapons and all that very stuff, which is also the case in 2025. More on that later. But if you're Zach Robinson and you're in 2024 and you're looking at this data, it's basically saying up to that point that pistol might be more effective than under center. So it makes sense for you as a coaching staff to basically say, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Let's continue to run the pistol. And then you couple that with other factors like Bijan Robinson being much more effective running out of the pistol than being under center. More on that later. Kirk Cousins coming off his Achilles injury in the pistol, relying on less movement from the quarterback to get to the mesh point for the handoff than under center would, all right? That takes pressure off of that Achilles injury, as well as Michael Penix coming from college offenses that were almost predominantly shotgun and pistol rather than under center. I think it's fair to say that the Falcons made an effective choice, right? Now, I also think it's fair to say that the Falcons should have ran more under center offense, especially in 2025. I think that's a fair criticism. However, I don't agree when people sit here and act like the Falcons utilizing the pistol as much as they did was a sign of bad coaching. As we often talk about, good versus bad coaching is putting your players in a position to succeed. And I do think the Falcons had valid reasons for thinking that in 2024 and 2025, they were doing just that by putting their players in a position to succeed by leaning on the pistol as much as they did. Now, this became an issue, a lightning rod issue in 2025, in large part due to this league-wide trend and a very high correlation between the most successful offense in the year of 2025, between the teams that had the most under center usage, as well as the most successful passing offenses in the league. If you look at this past season and look at the 10 teams that threw the most under center, according to Next Gen Stats, 8 of those 10 teams were also in the top 10 when it came to overall passing efficiency when measured by overall EPA per pass. Now, I didn't look up the numbers for every year going back to 2019, just looked at the 25, 24, and 23. And that was not the case in 23 and 24. That only 3 or 4 of the teams, top 10 teams in terms of under center usage in 23 and 24 were also in the top 10 in terms of overall passing effectiveness. And then also looking at the overall data set across all 7 seasons combined, only 4 of those top 10 teams that were highest in under center usage were also in the top 10 in overall passing efficiency. By the way, the Cleveland Browns under Kevin Stefanski for 6 out of those 7 years were 8th in overall under center usage, 8th most under center usage, but were 25th in passing EPA over that 7-year span. And so the conclusion we can reach is maybe 2025 is the beginning of a new trend across the league where there is going to continue to be this high correlation between under center usage and overall passing effectiveness, like we saw this past year. That may continue to be a trend in 26 and beyond. However, based off of the data I have seen over the last 7 years, it looks more like more of an outlier than necessarily the norm, right? Where the best passing offenses are also the teams that operate the most under center. So we'll see if that changes or continues in 2026. But hopefully the goal now is, and we've accomplished this goal, of you having a better understanding of why the Falcons didn't necessarily lean on under center. But I understand why there's optimism attached to why, if they do lean on it moving forward because of, recent trends. And it does seem that that is the plan under Kevin Stefanski and Tommy Rees. And we'll break down why they could benefit. But we'll also break down why it isn't necessarily this magic elixir that's going to solve all the Falcons' offensive problems, which is what has often been painted as over the last 6 months by Falcon fans, as well as Falcons media, as well as some select members of the national media, right? And a part of that is the Falcons' current personnel at quarterback and running back are mostly unproven when it comes to operating at a high level under center. But we'll also break down the 2 reasons why we think Michael Penix could benefit from an under center offense, and the real reason why the Falcons offense fell short in 2025 as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. So what if sports were traded like markets? Now you can put your sports IQ to work in real time with Robinhood prediction markets. It's not you against the house. It's you participating in a live market. You can buy or sell your positions live all game long. Use your sports knowledge in the moments that matter. Robinhood prediction markets changes the game. It's people moving the action. So when momentum shifts, you can move with it. I always knew the game, but never had a dynamic way to apply that knowledge. Now I can actually take part live in a market powered by people. You're no longer just a spectator. Play by play, you decide. Trade every play with Robinhood, now available across the U.S. Download the Robinhood app now to begin. Futures and cleared swaps trading involves significant risk and is not appropriate for everyone. Event contracts are offered by Robinhood Derivatives, LLC, a registered futures commission, merchant, and swap firm. So the offseason doesn't exist for the everydayer club, and you can join the group chat and talk about the Falcons year-round, as well as get every episode of Locked On Falcons ad-free by heading to the link in the show notes and description below at lockedonfalcons.supercast.com. So for me, it should be clearer now that pistol versus under center is not really to blame for the Falcons' 2025 passing struggles. Again, I think it's fair to criticize some of those issues on it, but I think, and I think if you believe that the Falcons would have benefited from using more under center, I generally agree with you, but it's not the main reason why this offense struggled. The Falcons' offense, was really good for most of 2025 in terms of generating play action passing, right? They were second in EPA per play when operating at a play action after their bye week. So from week 6 onward, they were the second best play action offense in the league based off of that efficiency metric. And that wasn't due to any switch from pistol to under center, although they did run more under center after their bye week, but that only really started in week 12. Right? And so there were plenty of games where they were operating a high level play action passing, from week 6 through week 11 when Penix was operating mostly in pistol. The main reason for the Falcons' failure on offense in 2025, in my humble opinion, is because of wide receiver play. In 2024, the Falcons had the NFL's worst play action passing attack. Right? We spent all of last offseason basically saying if they can just get an average play action passing attack, it's going to allow this offense to grow from middle of the pack to, a top 5, top 10 type unit. But that did not occur in 2025, right? And, that wasn't because they had a very good play action attack in 2025. But the reason for that is the Falcons play action offense in 2024 only accounted for about 13% of their passes. In 2025, that grew to about 22%. But that's essentially what that translates to, doing the math. And again, I know math doesn't exactly work like this, but essentially 9% of the Falcons offense improved in 2025, while the remaining 91% of it got worse, primarily because of a massive drop in performance from the wide receivers. Drake London and Darnell Mooney, guys, are, Nickelodeon remake for Drake and Josh, right? Were a top 3 wide receiver duo in 2024. But then Drake London was hurt for basically 60% hurt or limited for 60% of 2025. Darnell Mooney was hurt for all of it and played poorly for 100% of 2025. Ray McLeod and Kadero Hodge were solid contributors in 2024, were non-factors in 2025 because of not being able to play, because Ray was cut after week 4 and Kadero Hodge was just an afterthought in the offense. And unfortunately for the Falcons, David Sills, Casey Washington, Dylan Drummond, Devin Tompkins could not step up and fill those shoes. And so when we talk about the hopes for the Falcons offense improving in 2026, most of that for me personally, based off of that reason, is attached more to it, hopefully improved wide receiver play. It's attached to Jahan Dotson and Olamide Zaccheaus and whoever the Falcons draft in April. It's attached to having a healthier Drake London in 2026, as well as getting more effective contributions from Kyle Pitts, especially when Drake London has been healthy, as we've discussed ad nauseum on this podcast over the last 3 months. That has not been something that has been a regular occurrence for this team over the last 4 years, that these two guys have played together, where one is good and the other one is a non-factor, pretty much. And so we need both of these guys to be a factor in order to maximize this passing attack, right? And that, to me, is what is going to lead to more greater success for the Falcons offense in 2026 than necessarily what the narrative has been is, hey, if they just get under center, all their problems go away. And part of that is due to the aforementioned reasons on why under center isn't this magic fix. And a lot of it is also tied to the fact that this quarterback room isn't necessarily proven in terms of operating under center at a high level. If we talk about Tua Tagovailoa, who spent about 10% of his snaps across his career in Miami under center. He had more pistol snaps, about 12%, and in the remainder being shotgun snaps. And he was more effective in the pistol and shotgun, right? His best success rate was operated out of the pistol. Second best was in the shotgun. His best EPA per play was in the shotgun. Second best was in the pistol. Under center was consistently his worst alignment. And then, of course, you have Michael Penix, who has almost no body of work when it comes to suggesting that he'd be better in under center, because only less than 2% of his entire dropbacks came under center. Only 6 plays where Michael Penix dropped back under center in his NFL career. Now, when you look at those 6 plays, you can find roughly, half of them being good plays and the other half of being questionable plays, right? And so there's nothing really definitive. So it's really a toss-up on whether or not Penix is better under center. And as I mentioned before, Penix was predominantly a shotgun and pistol quarterback in college. Now, I don't know the exact number in terms of the percentage of dropbacks that he did operate under center, but I'm very confident that it's less than 10%, if not less than 5%. And then, of course, we have Bijan Robinson. Bijan is a more efficient runner in pistol than he is under center. He has a 52% success rate in pistol versus a 46% success rate under center, according to True Media. And for the record, the most efficient running back in the NFL over the last 3 years that has been Bijan Robinson's career is Kyren Williams, which is a 54% success rate, versus the average when you talk about the lead running backs in the NFL, so the top 40 or so running backs in the NFL, their average success rate is about 46%. So essentially, when Bijan is in the pistol, he is essentially an elite running back, one of the best in the league. And when he is operating under center, he's basically average for a RB1 across the league. So when the Falcons' new coaching staff under Kevin Stefanski and Tommy Rees say, hey, we are firmly believers in under center, and all indications are that the Falcons are going to lean heavily on under center to a similar degree as the Browns did over the last 7 years, right? Again, 8th most in the NFL in that span. It doesn't necessarily mean that the Falcons' offense is actually or automatically going to benefit from that change. And to be clear, just because Tua and Bijan and Penix haven't proven themselves to be, highly effective under center quarterbacks to date, as they have been, highly effective players in the pistol and shotgun to date, does not mean that they can't prove that in 2026 and beyond. And that's going to be a big part of the coaching element, improved coaching element, for example, with Falcons quarterback coach Alex Van Pelt being renowned for his ability to improve footwork and ball fakes, a critical element of selling the play action from under center. And this was a notable area of weakness for Michael Penix last year, as you guys may recall, all the pirouetting that he was doing in the backfield, trying to sell these terrible ball fakes that he was doing. And so there's very high optimism that we will see big improvement from that with this coaching staff. And we know Bijan is a very capable running back. And the expectation for me, at least, is it might take up to a year for him to adjust to being more in an under center offense. But I think he's more than capable of being just as elite in an under center offense as he is in a pistol offense. So it's not to paint this doom and gloom portrait. It's just really a matter of faith versus evidence, right? That Locked On Falcons being this evidence-based podcast as opposed to this faith-based podcast. And so if you believe that the under center is going to equal greater success for the offense, that's more of a faith-based area. That's just faith, right? As opposed to actual evidence pointing in that direction. But let's give two reasons that if we are going to be, on the rare occasions, a faith-based podcast here on Locked On Falcons, why under center can benefit Michael Penix. That first reason is hopefully by getting more under center and operating more play action, we will see growth with Michael Penix's ability to attack the middle of the field. Penix has attempted 38.5% of his passes over the middle of the field, which is basically between the numbers, right? Based off of PFF charting, which is the lowest rate in the NFL over the last two seasons. And we expect that number is going to increase in 2026. The question of course, is going to be how much of that is going to be increased. But Penix is, unproven in that regard, but generally, not necessarily with under center and play action, but generally has been effective when he has thrown the ball over the middle of the field. It's just we haven't seen it necessarily with the under center and play action aspect. And so that's why we can sit here and be hopeful in that faith-based sort of perspective, rather than necessarily being optimistic because we have clear evidence that says, oh, he'll benefit from this. But I think this is an area of growth where Penix needs to grow in order to reach his full potential in the NFL as the Falcons quarterback. The second reason is hopefully by operating more under center, you will improve the timing in the offense. Now, I'm sure some of you have heard Matt Ryan talk about this very fact on his podcast during the 2025 season, where that he believes dropping back from under center enhances the timing of the offense, right? You can sync up the quarterback hitting his back step with the receivers hitting their landmarks in the passing game, right? That essentially when you're operating at a pistol and shotgun, the quarterback is getting to that back step earlier than the route concepts are dialing it up, and that can throw off the timing of the play. And I think that was especially an issue early in the 2025 season with Michael Penix that I did think got better as the season wore on. And so hopefully we will see things start to slow down for Michael Penix, build a stronger rapport and connection with his receivers by improving those areas. So for me, those are the two main reasons why I'm hopeful that Penix will benefit from under center offense, attacking the middle of the field more effectively, as well as improving the timing of the offense and building stronger rapport with his receivers. But at this point, it's more of an issue of can versus will, right? Can the under center lead to greater success from Michael Penix? Yes. Will it? Time will tell on that issue. So this is not the last time that we will probably be talking about under center on this podcast between now and the start of the season. But to me, over the last 6 months since the start of last season, I feel like there's been a lot of discourse that is not based off of facts, that is not based off of evidence. And basically, it's a lot of people cherry picking those evidence to fit a narrative of basically being like, oh, this is the reason why the Falcons offense is failing, versus what we try to do here on Locked On Falcons, which is we look at the evidence and then create a narrative based off of the evidence that we find. But, another thing we like to do here on Locked On Falcons is dictate the moves that the Atlanta Falcons make. Right? Last week, we talked about the Falcons adding a QB3 as well as an RB2 on the podcast, and the Falcons did that on Tuesday, signing Trevor Simeon and Brian Robinson, and we'll break down what they're bringing to the table as we wrap up today's Locked On Falcons. This time of year where all you really want is something warm, easy, and satisfying to eat, there's, nothing like Home Chef, today's sponsor. And that's why Home Chef is such a go-to. It takes the stress out of dinner and makes it simple to actually enjoy cooking again. Home Chef makes cooking easy with fresh, pre-proportioned ingredients, simple recipes, and meals that taste great. Love the fact that their meals are convenient and quick, from 30-minute recipes to oven-ready options when you don't want to think, as well as a ton of variety, over 30 meals each week, so it never feels repetitive. It just makes dinner feel manageable as well as on your busiest days. So for a limited time, Home Chef is offering my listeners half off, 50% off, and free shipping on your first box, plus free dessert for life. All you got to do is go to homechef.com/lockedonnfl. That's homechef.com for 50% off your first box and free dessert for life. Must be an active subscriber to receive your free dessert. So last week on Thursday's Falcons squad show, we mentioned how QB3 was a vacant position that the Falcons should wind up filling next. And then on Friday, we mentioned how the next spot that the Falcons should wind up signing is an RB2 to replace Tyler Algier. And we want to give a special shout out to that Atlanta Falcons intern that, is a everydayer of this podcast that ran it up the ladder to Ian Cunningham, the Falcons GM, and saying, Ian, this guy named Aaron Freeman, aka Sirius Black, was out here being serious, talking about QB3 and RB2 on this podcast, and you got to get on this. And Ian was like, I got you, intern. All right, you're a good guy. So, the Falcons wind up signing QB3 and Trevor Simeon. They signed their RB2 and Brian Robinson Jr. on Tuesday. Let's talk about Simeon. Age 34, journeyman player. Falcons are going to be his 8th team since entering the NFL in 2015. His most prominent action over the last decade plus has been those 2 seasons where he was the Broncos' primary starter in 2016, 2017. He was the guy that replaced Peyton Manning, overshadowing, Paxton Lynch, one of the biggest first-round busts of the last decade, and Simeon sort of stepped into that role and gave them functional starting quarterback play, although, wasn't great. Then once Denver started, going to the Case Keenums and the Joe Flaccos and the Drew Locks and whatnot, and then eventually Russell Wilson before finally landing on Bo Nix. They wound up trading Trevor Simeon to the Vikings in 2018. He crossed paths with a then quarterbacks coach and soon-to-be play caller in Kevin Stefanski. You may have heard of him. And ultimately, he's going to be filling that QB3 spot. And the reason why that position matters and why we've talked about the need for the Falcons to do that is because Tua Tagovailoa and Michael Penix have very, expansive injury histories and aren't necessarily known for being the most durable guys. And you might need your QB3 to kind of step in and, lead, run the ship and allow this team to tread water for an unknown period of time. Right. And so arguably QB3 is a much more important issue for the Atlanta Falcons because of the top 2 quarterbacks' injury history than it is for pretty much any other team in the league. Now, I'm sure some of you are like, hey, man, we could have done a lot better than Trevor Simeon, which I think has been the common complaint for a lot of the Falcons offseason moves so far. It's like, well, we could get better players than that guy. Right. And that's certainly true. But it's more likely that a lot of the guys that are better than Trevor Simeon, we're not going to settle for being QB3, that they're QB2s and get paid accordingly. The Tyrod Taylors, the Cooper Rushes, the Josh Dobbs, and the Zach Wilsons. And then you have the guys like the Joe Flacco and Russell Wilson and Jimmy G, who are guys that are probably not looking for a QB3 job or are looking for a path towards being some team's QB1 this offseason. Kirk Cousins is also on that list as well. But we already know that's not going to be the case with Kirk returning. Now, we don't know the details of Simeon's deals, but we can make a pretty educated guess that it's probably at or slightly above veteran minimum. And so Simeon is essentially like so many of the Falcons offensive free agent moves and off-season moves, getting you pretty good bang for your buck, right? In terms of someone who has actually started games and some of the other options that are also vet minimum guys like Jeff Driscoll, Skylar Thompson, Easton Stick, right? And Simeon's had a greater degree of success than a lot of those guys have been over the course of his career as a starter. Now with Brian Robinson, we know that the Falcons potentially had an opening with Tyler Algier's departure. He's a grinder. I had a Locked On Falcons insider being like, hey, man, I would have preferred Tyler Algier. And it's like, yeah, you would have, but, Tyler Algier is a better player. But he would have cost $6 million to keep, if not more. Falcons probably would have had to overpay that $6 million he got from Arizona to keep him. And Brian Robinson only costing you $2.5 million. So, again, bang for your buck. Now, Robinson is 3rd-round pick out of Alabama with Washington in 2022, part of that same draft class as Tyler Algier. He was a guy that I loved in that draft class. He was my, sort of ideal target for the Falcons in that draft class. The Falcons wound up settling for Tyler Algier. I think the Falcons arguably made out better with Tyler Algier than the Washington Commanders did with Brian Robinson. He was Washington's RB1 for his first 3 seasons in the NFL, pretty consistently hitting, 700, roughly 800 yards a year. Tough physical running back. Not a lot of wiggle to his game. The big knock on Brian Robinson has always been he's going to get you the yards that your offensive line blocks for you and not much more beyond that. In terms of average yards after contact, he's been slightly below average over across his NFL career, averaging about 2.9 yards after contact, according to True Media, when the NFL average over the last 4 seasons has been about 3.0 yards per contact. Bijan is 3.4. Tyler Algier, 3.3, 2 of the better running backs when it comes to getting yards after contact over the last 4 seasons. And Then the Commanders drafted Bill Krosky-Merritt this past offseason, looking to upgrade that position, and he did, right? Especially when it came to yards after contact, 3.5 yards per contact in Krosky-Merritt's rookie season. And Washington wound up trading Brian Robinson to San Francisco before the start of the season. And to Robinson's credit, his yards after contact did improve in San Francisco, right, with a career high 3.1, right? So above average this past year. And part of that may be owed to benefiting from playing in more outside zone run scheme, not necessarily because, due to yards after contact in the outside zone, but, Washington was this gap heavy inside running sort of team and much more of that 3 yards in a cloud of dust type of run game. And given the greater space that San Francisco's outside zone scheme allows, it seemingly led to greater production for Brian Robinson with career highs in success rate and yards per carry. He also probably benefited from a lighter workload this past season, averaging only 5 carries per game in San Francisco in 2025 after 14 across his 3 years in Washington. And we'll see what the workload is going to be for the RB2. I'm thinking it's probably going to be closer to 5 than 14 in 2026. And we expect the Falcons to use a healthy mix of gap and zone runs this upcoming season. I think running back is still going to be an option for the Falcons in the draft. Going back to yesterday's show with Dave Choate, getting a solid RB2 option in the building pre-draft to me made sense, as Dave explained. And so you're not going into the draft pressed to take on our running back at some point in the draft. And we've discussed this on the podcast before, where the Falcons are really building a 53 before the draft so that they're not forced to rely on need going into the draft. And that's seemingly coming to fruition. I don't expect the Falcons to draft a quarterback this year, but it's certainly on the table. If someone slides that they really like, they could absolutely throw us a curveball. You never put anything past the Atlanta Falcons, right? And take a quarterback on day 2, Ty Simpson or Garrett Nussmeier if they're there. But again, I'm not expecting that going. And so I think more than likely we'll see the Falcons bring in like an undrafted free agent at quarterback after the draft. But I do think running back is still going to be on the table for the draft. So, we could wind up on next episode breaking down more of the Falcons building that 53, as well as discuss maybe some of the things that Tua Tagovailoa said in his presser on Tuesday. I haven't listened to it yet. I just saw some of the quotes on Twitter, but I'll listen to it and see if there's anything interesting that Tua said that's worth discussing. And that will be potentially your next episode. So don't miss that episode. And if you never miss an episode of Locked On Falcons, the Everydayer Club is built for you. Get Locked On Falcons ad-free, as well as members-only Discord access and so much more at the link in the description at lockedonfalcons.supercast.com. So go check it out. It's all part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.